Hello and welcome to another session here on day 2 of the Berwick Literary Festival. My name is Gerry Foley, and just a reminder that there'll be plenty of time for questions. Just use the Q&A function on the Zoom box if you like, and I'll make sure that I'll leave plenty of time for those questions. And I'm sure you'll have a lot to say, because this book, All in It Together, which is all about recent history from 2000 right up to 2016, just before the Brexit referendum, the road to Brexit really, and the many highs and lows, twists and turns, not only in politics, but also in social, cultural, economic, entertainment worlds, which makes it such a fascinating read, and one which the social historian Alwyn has once again produced a very readable book. So let's welcome Alwyn along to the Berwick Literary Festival. And once he joins us, I'm going to ask him obviously the first question, which will be, there he is, the man himself. Lovely to see you. Thanks very much for joining us. Alwyn, I'm going to start with one of the big issues and the big themes, partially because last month, obviously, was the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Lots of anniversary programs, lots of think pieces about how significant it was. It features prominently in your book in terms of not only the international fallout, but the domestic impact it had on Tony Blair's reputation. Let's start on 9/11 itself. He was in Brighton about to speak to the Trade Union Congress conference.
Yeah, and it was a speech that was interrupted, obviously. He didn't deliver it. Rushed back to London on the train, and curiously, in just an ordinary train. And his immediate response of "we stand shoulder to shoulder with America," I think was broadly understood and welcomed. I think the public was still on side at that point. I think there was still broad support for when we became involved in the invasion of Afghanistan, because there was a clear link there. This appalling crime had been committed, and the idea that something had to be done was genuine and proper. And then he stayed shoulder to shoulder with America for the invasion of Iraq. And I think that's the point at which things really change. It's not 9/11 itself, which is obviously a huge event and massive in American history, but in British terms, I think it's the Iraq bit that really makes the difference.
And as you say early on in the book, after 9/11, he was, if you like, Blair, almost an international leader. You say he traveled 40,000 miles in the space of a couple of weeks, met 54 leaders to bring this coalition together. But there was also domestic support. And Afghanistan, they thought, was done in a matter of months. And then we get to 2003, and you find 1 million people marching up and down Whitehall saying, "No war in Iraq." Yeah. But he went ahead with it.
And I think the problem with Iraq was not simply the war itself and the endless arguments over whether we had United Nations clearance to do it and approval and all of that. It was the fact that it was Tony Blair, and that the perception grew very rapidly that he had lied to take us to war.
Which he would deny, obviously.
Of course, and whether it's true or not, whether that accusation is genuine or not is not really the question. It's the impact that it had. People came to that conclusion. He had told us that we were going to war because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction that were capable of being deployed, and then we discovered that he didn't. And it was assumed that Tony Blair had known that, and that he was using the weapons of mass destruction as a pretext for joining America because he was committed to joining America. And that's a problem because it undercut Tony Blair's USP, really. I mean, his whole raison d'etre as a politician was that he was not like other politicians. It made such a big deal in the 1990s as leader of the opposition about Tory sleaze and corruption, in contrast to which he declared himself to be a fairly straight guy. And prime ministers often fail and fall because they undercut their own platform. It's the same as James Callaghan became Prime Minister largely because he was the man who worked with the trade unions. And then in the winter of discontent, he stopped working with the trade unions and he was brought down. It's the same kind of process. Tony Blair is all about being honest and a decent bloke and a fairly straight guy. And he's the one who lied and took us to war. And the war had no obvious benefit to Britain. It was.
We started big because it's a big part of your book, which is this breach of trust between those who are leading us and us who are led. And we'll come to that and develop it. So it's not all just about politics, but I just want to stay on one other moment here, because the other thing which is current at present, of course, is the BBC series looking at the tension between Blair and Brown, with Gordon Brown pushing, waiting for his moment to take over, which he does in 2007. And you deal with the loss of faith and confidence in Gordon Brown, which happened fairly rapidly after a few months when it seemed to be going okay.
Yes, and exactly the same process. Gordon Brown's great selling point as a politician was that he believed in social justice and that he was good at managing the economy. He'd been 10 years as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and there'd been 10 positive years. I mean, economic growth in every single quarter. I mean, they constantly told us the longest period of economic growth in Britain's history, and all of that.
The end to boom and bust.
Absolutely. And then we had a bust. And then the credit crunch led into the Great Recession. Lots of people lost their jobs. Businesses went bust. He was no longer capable of running the economy, it seemed. And even worse than that, nobody paid the price for it in terms of those who were responsible for having created this absurd international financial situation. No bankers went to jail. It was the ordinary people who were hit. So that whole claim to social justice suddenly fell apart as well. It seemed as if Gordon Brown was very good at protecting those who had caused the crash, and it was taken out on us, and we faced a recession, which we've still not really recovered from.
And you do make reference to the Queen's much quoted comment when she was down at the Bank of England. If there were so many obvious warning signals, why did none of you guys see this coming down the track?
It was not a good time for experts, as Michael Gove was later to point out.
Actually, when we're talking about experts, actually, because this is one of the themes that sort of runs through the book, and it's also current at present. We have the new series of Strictly Come Dancing, which is on the BBC at present, still immensely popular. But you do highlight 2008, the John Sargent episode, the former BBC political correspondent, ITN political editor, and how well he was doing and how popular he was with the public despite being an awful dancer. And this was something of us versus them.
It was. It's the main theme of the book, but kind of encapsulated in a perhaps trivial way, except that a lot of people watch Strictly Come Dancing. It's almost as many people as vote in elections. It's certainly more than vote in local elections. So it kind of does matter. It's part of people's lives. And yeah, he was an awful dancer, and he knew he was an awful dancer, and it was a joke. But people liked that because it was an entertainment program. But the judges, because the BBC doesn't like to just trust the audience, it has to have a panel of judges as well. And the experts were convinced that this was a program about dancing as opposed to entertaining. And they were furious with the public for continually failing to vote him off the program. And it got to the stage, obviously, when he withdrew because he said there was a real danger that he might win it, and that would be a joke too far. But I think that it does encapsulate a time when the people want to have their voices heard. And that's the whole point of reality television programs, is that it does ask the public what they think. And then don't be upset too much if they don't think the same as you. Well, you know, if they were going to agree with you, you don't need them.
Well, when you say television and the people's voice being heard via the reality programs and everything else, there's a fascinating contrast between the political style, humor, and in some cases, pretty similar content between the Teesside controversialist, I suppose, comedian Chubby Brown, and a more sophisticated, but still pretty blue, I've seen him live, Jimmy Carr. And you draw contrast then in terms of what was deemed acceptable to be heard nationally and what people actually wanted to go and see.
Yeah, when I first put a proposal for this book to publishers, it was a long proposal. It was 14,000 words.
Wow.
And Roy Chubby Brown was not mentioned. He was not part of my plans whatsoever. But the idea of controversial comedy was part of what I was thinking. I was thinking about Jimmy Carr and Frankie Boyle, these two figures who were often described as being transgressive comedians who went that bit further, pushed the boundaries of taste and overstepped and got in trouble. And increasingly, as I was working on the book, it became apparent that however transgressive they were still on television. They were still getting their own TV shows. I mean, they were hosts of television programs and still are.
Big shows.
Whereas Roy Chubby Brown never welcomed on television. I mean, he was on Top of the Pops once with his duet with Smokey doing living next door to Alice. And if the next line comes immediately to you, then you are aware of
it's mid-afternoon on a Friday. Let's leave it with that. Yeah. But he wasn't getting the TV, but he was not allowed on the country.
But he was the biggest live draw for several years. He was the biggest live comedian on the circuit, and that seemed to me quite interesting. That there's this man who has built this extraordinary success and is still persona non grata when it comes to broadcasting. And I think it is because the jokes that he did, people thought that he might mean them. Whereas Jimmy Carr, it is assumed that when he does a sexist joke, it is with a note of irony to it. And his audience are sophisticated enough to understand that he is being ironic. He has been to university. They have mostly been to university. We are all intelligent people and we can understand what he's doing, and he's playing with us. Whereas Roy Chubby Brown is working class. His audiences are working class. They are not, for the most part, university educated. And we do not trust that they are viewing this ironically. We think that when Roy Chubby Brown does a sexist joke or a racist joke, he means it, and his audience mean it as well, and therefore he is beyond the pale. And I'm not entirely sure that that is correct, and I'm not sure that it's really the way that we should be judging this anyway, because it feels to me like he does have a part to play.
And part of your argument here is that he was playing, these big events. He was selling literally millions of DVDs of his comedy material. And these were people who felt, we don't see him on TV, but he speaks for us in many ways. And that was the exclusion process already been reflected.
And the more you exclude, the more it seems like a political thing for that you're excluding him for. It's not simply on the question of taste, because obviously the language that he used, he would not be able to use on television. But Roy Chubby Brown is not a stupid man. I mean, he writes all his own material and has done for his entire career. And you don't do that and build a career that lasts for decades without knowing what you're doing and being a craftsman. He would be perfectly capable of adapting his material to appear on television to be acceptable, but nobody wants him there, and they don't invite him. And I think it's a division between, as I say, I think university is the key to this. This is it. Have you been properly approved? Have you gone through a decent liberal education and emerged knowing that you can laugh at Jimmy Carr, but only because you know that it's forbidden? And I think probably Roy Chubby Brown's audiences know that as well. But also, if you watch a video of Roy Chubby Brown and it cuts to the audience, my guess is that probably most of that audience would be voting for Brexit. And that's
a perfect cue, because the next couple I wanted to bring together, because you bring them together in the book, of course, Robert Kilroy-Silk and Nigel Farage. They had a intense but short-lived battle for the soul of UKIP in 2004. Both of them fascinating characters. Let's start with Kilroy-Silk. A lot of people will remember him primarily from his TV show, which was a sort of early Germany Carl in some ways, I suppose. So tell us why you felt that was important to reflect and what it told us about the way in which the emerging, and it was only emerging at that stage really, UKIP was going to develop under Farage.
I mean, Kilroy still before that, he was a Labour MP, and had great hopes. I mean, when he was elected, he had a camera crew in the car as he drove down to Westminster, and he told them that he was going to be Prime Minister in a number of years, but he was going to be Prime Minister. He was a good-looking man. He was an intelligent man. He was incredibly articulate. That's why he hosted a daytime TV program for all those years. But unfortunately, he got lost in the battles of the 1980s. He spent a lot of time battling militants in his constituency up in Liverpool and so on. And he jumped ship and decided to become a TV presenter instead. And then clearly the political bug was still there. And the emergence of UKIP, who got 3 MEPs elected in the 1999 European parliamentary elections. They were big enough that it was worth him maybe making an intervention. But only if he could become leader, really. I mean, he had no intention of being a foot soldier. He'd done that and he'd given it up. So he wanted to be the leader. And he believed that he had the popularity that had been acquired over being on TV every day for so many years. He had the profile and he had the support, and he was going to be the great populist leader. And for a brief moment, it did seem in 2004, which is when UKIP had their real breakthrough in the European elections, and he got elected to the European Parliament, it did feel as if he might really mean something. He might be important. And it turned out he did. The ego was greater. Maybe it's the other way around. The ego wasn't great enough to overcome Farage.
I think that's actually probably closer to the mark. But there's a nice little line, actually, because he stayed with UKIP for only 8 months after he was elected as an MEP in 2004. Eventually, he lost the battle, basically, to become #1. And then he set up his own party called Veritas for Truth. And as you point out in the book, it was called
Vanitas, which entirely appropriately.
Now you do put,
claim, and then he disappears, and it's almost as though he never happened, but he did.
But the man who doesn't disappear, and you say by the end of the book, you put him as the most successful and important campaigner of those first 15, 16 years of this century, was Farage. And I want to go back to something you mentioned about Kilroy Silk being first elected and having a camera crew in the car as he was driving down to Westminster. Very unusual for a newly elected MP. I found out from your book that Nigel Farage also took, without a camera crew, but a very important political journey when he was driving, of all people, Enoch Powell to a by-election in 1993, long before UKIP really came into existence.
It was, I think, a really important moment. It was, Enoch Powell was coming to the end of his life. I think he died in 95 or 96.
96, yeah, I think, yeah.
And the Newbury by-election came just as the long saga of Maastricht was reaching its climax in the House of Commons. It had taken 18 months of endless wrangling and civil war in the Conservative Party, destroying the Major government, John Major's government. And Newbury was a rock-solid, safe Tory seat that fell to the Liberals in that by-election. And down the ballot paper was Alan Sked, standing as an anti-federalist. And he invited Enoch Powell to come down and speak. And Nigel Farage, who was then a young city trader, was given the job of driving Powell from London to Newbury and back again, and credits that the time that he spent in the car with Powell as being what inspired him to pursue his political career. And in a very real sense, Nigel Farage is Enoch Powell's last great gift to the nation.
And there's a
he did make many other appearances.
And there's a secularity to that, because later in the book, and this is why the book is so brilliant at bringing together all of these different strands and personalities. You talk about the time when Russell Brand, the comedian, for about 2 years, 2013, 2015, somehow emerged as an influential political figure. And he slapped down Nigel Farage very successfully on Question Time by calling him a pound shop Enoch Powell.
Indeed, yes, and some truth to that. But I do think, I mean, it's more than Farage being the most influential campaigner of that period. I think he is the single most significant political figure since Margaret Thatcher. He has changed the course of this country. He has changed our history in a way that politicians very seldom do. Politicians are not very important people. I mean, we flatter them, and we like to give them a little bit of attention so they feel happy, but they don't really set the tone of the country. And that's why I do so much stuff about popular culture in books, because I think that's what does set a tone to a large extent. But Farage, however many, I lost track of how many times he's tried to get into Westminster and failed.
It's certainly 6 or 7.
Yeah. And he's been elected to the European Parliament, but that's a list system, you know. And yet, despite the fact that he has no formal power or position really, he has managed to change the history of the country, and this is an extraordinary achievement. I mean, whether one agrees or disagrees with where he stands, his influence is so much greater than anybody else. I mean, the country is a different place for him having existed. I'm not sure that it's a different place for, I don't know, John Major having existed, and he was Prime Minister.
Okay, well, let's just pursue that a little bit more, because one of the ways in which Farage and UKIP were able to build a public profile was, of course, down to a very significant decision by the European Union, which was that from 1999, all elections to the European Parliament have to be done on a proportional basis. So get rid of the first past the post, which is how we elect our MPs, which has proved so personally fatal to his chances, Farage's chances of being an MP. And of course, they start to get a block of votes, and they get bigger and bigger until they eventually win the European elections. And that gives him a bigger voice.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, there's a great irony, as you say, it was the European Union that decided that we had to change first past the post. One of the advantages of first past the post is that it keeps out small parties. I mean, that's an advantage if you support a large party, obviously. If you support the Greens, it's a terrible thing. But part of the point is to keep out extremes. And we used to run the European Parliament on that basis. I mean, the constituencies were larger because we have fewer MEPs, but the principle was the same. It was at first past the post, and a party like UKIP stood no chance whatsoever. And then the European Union changed the regulations. We are obliged to adopt a form of PR. And the first great beneficiaries of this, and indeed continuing to be the beneficiaries, is Farage and whatever group that he's in at the time.
I want to move on in a moment to immigration and how you look at the impact immigration had, not only on the country, but on people's views of what the country was becoming, and how Farage and UKIP capitalized on that. But you say one of his gifts as a campaigner was that, despite coming from a posh background himself, public school boy, like many of the era, he was able to aggregate a whole series of grievances, complaints, a feeling of being left out, left behind, and focus it in on laser-like on Europe as being the real cause. So that was an achievement to do that.
Yes, I think so. There was a lot of discontent in a whole lot of different areas, and he presented UKIP as being the ultimate protest vote. And here's a target that you can all aim at. It's Brussels bureaucrats. And frankly, if you're going to complain about a ruling class that has lost touch with the electorate, then I think Brussels bureaucrats are probably a pretty fair target, to be honest. But he does bring all that stuff together. And yeah, he comes from this posh background. He's public school, he's a city trader. But then populist leaders in Britain tend to. You know, Enoch Powell was not exactly a member of the hoi polloi. I mean, he was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but he did have a double first in classics, and he was the youngest professor in the English-speaking world, and so on. I mean, you know, he was an intellectual. People don't mind that. What people wanted was the concept of authenticity, and Farage never pretended to be anything that he wasn't, and I think this is not always recognised because a great many people dislike Farage a great deal. It's not always recognised. He genuinely believes what he's saying in a way that politicians are not always credited with. When he joined UKIP, he was one of the founder members with Alan Sked after that Newbury by-election.
Yeah.
And it was a ludicrous thing to get into. He had been a member of the Tory party. And he has the abilities that if he'd stayed in the Tory party, he could reasonably have expected to end up very senior indeed. And instead of that, he throws in his lot with a party that stands absolutely no chance, not even any chance of getting anywhere in Europe, because when UKIP is formed, we still have first past the post. It is the most pointless, hopeless endeavour. But he believes it enough that he throws himself into it. He eventually gives up his job and spends his life campaigning for this, because he means it and he is genuine. And,
you take all
people
of that.
recognize that, and people respect. I think a lot of people respected that, even if they didn't agree with him.
No, I think that's a fair assumption analysis from your point of view. But I think also, if you gathered a room of people who had had to work directly with Nigel Farage over the years, the many years at UKIP and other parties, they would find that, you know, he was pretty ruthless, and his ego, you know, played a big role in I'm the voice, even when it came to the referendum, which official body was going to be recognized by the Electoral Commission. Another day for that. The other thing I wanted to come to, because I mentioned, and it is obviously critical in your book, is the level of immigration. Now, in 2004, when the EU expanded to the east, the EU, those faceless bureaucrats, as you say, in Brussels, did give every existing member, 15 countries, the option of delaying free movement of people for 7 years. Ease it in. Take it easy, guys, and then we'll see where we're at. And Britain, Ireland, and Sweden to say, no, let's have everybody in right from the start. And that's where the trouble started, because the Home Office and the Labour government of the day were telling people, yeah, we'll have free movement, but there won't be that many people who'll be coming.
No.
And we know what happened next.
It was in the thousands, and it turned out to be in the millions. I mean, the level of failing to predict was absolutely catastrophically large. And why we do this? Well, we're back to Iraq again. It comes at the time when Britain is isolated in Europe because we are the ones supporting America. And we need allies in Europe. And there are these new countries joining, and Tony Blair thinks they are potentially our allies. We do not wish to do anything to upset them. We will have free immigration because then they will be on our side, and we will form an opposition bloc to the axis of France and Germany. So it virtually everything with Blair comes back to Iraq at some point. And it is unprecedented. I mean, we've never had immigration on that scale before. We had already seen a massive rise in net migration in Britain from the beginning of the new Labour government in 1997. There had been a substantial rise already, but then it becomes absolutely huge. And it is a different type of immigration, because so much of it is clearly not permanent. It is a transitory force. These are people who have come here because there is work to be had, but they are not expecting necessarily to spend the rest of their lives and for their children to spend the rest of their lives in this country.
Although, in fairness, Alwyn, that wasn't always obvious to the communities where the migrants ended up. It felt like these people were here, and they were here in great numbers, and our community has been transformed, not just for the next 2 or 3 years, but for the next 20 or 30 years.
Indeed, I think that's true. But I also think the fact that it's different in kind also plays into that, because it makes it feel as though we are in a stage of permanent change. It's to some extent immigration can reinforce social relationships. There is a new group of people, but they are fitting in. There is a network. There is a structure. But if people are passing through, that feels slightly different again. But I think it was the fact that it touched so many parts of the country that had not previously been touched by immigration. It's no use London talking about it, because London has been built on immigration for a very, very long time. But parts of the West Country that had seen virtually no immigrants ever, suddenly finding that there are 3 or 4 Polish shops opening in I don't know, in Taunton or wherever. It was reaching bits of the country that it was just an entirely novel experience.
Well, you give a very good example, and a very striking example, and it remains striking because of how powerful it was at the time. So 2004, the gates open. The reference here is to 2013 on Question Time, when Mary Beard, the academic, was talking about the benefits of immigration and what it was doing to the country and how they were contributing to society. And a woman in the audience, and this was in Lincolnshire, who lived in Louth, which was one of the centres of a lot of agricultural-based migration, she was very forceful in how it was changing her community, even though she herself, one of her parents was Polish after the war.
Yeah. But it was places like that, and Boston and Peterborough and so on, where it was new, and it was because so much of the immigration was young, and it was coming because there was work to be had. So on the one side, they are bringing in income and paying taxes and so on. There is an economic benefit here. But they are also going to affect schooling because they are likely to have young children as opposed to grown-up children. And it starts to impact on people. But I think it was not an economic argument. It felt more cultural. It was things are not the same. And as I say, it's touching parts of the country where things had been the same for a very long time. Not the same, but you know what I mean? There's a kind of gradual change. And then there's this sudden abrupt shift in places where it was not expected.
Okay, so we've gone on the big picture of migration, which leads up obviously towards the vote in 2016, the Brexit vote. I want to go back down to a small event, but actually an important event, and it shows how politicians can be caught off guard, and that's Greggs and the pasty tax in the budget of 2012. I remember this very well because I was working for Tyne-Tees Television. Greggs obviously are a northeast company. It was a huge issue for the region, and indeed it caused problems, big problems for George Osborne and David Cameron. So tell us why that was so significant.
It's a lesson that should have been learned from the past. Back in the 1980s, Nigel Lawson had put VAT on fast food takeaways, and the fish and chip tax, as it was dubbed at the time, was deeply controversial because any new tax is going to be, but particularly if it's on something that seems everyday and normal. You know, if you're going to invent a completely new tax or find a new subject to tax, you've got to have some kind of justification for it. And Nigel Lawson didn't really. He was attacking our takeaways. And the problem with it was that left open a loophole because it was only shops, it was takeaway restaurants were affected by this. And by the early part of this century, it was becoming perfectly normal for supermarkets to have hot food counters. And so you go to Sainsbury's and you could buy a pasty there, and you would not pay VAT on it because it was a food shop and not a takeaway shop. So it was unfair to the small fish and
Takeaway
chip
shop,
shops
yeah.
and the takeaways. And the idea that Osborne had was we should extend this across to all hot food takeaway, which would include the supermarkets. And it was intended to be fair and to protect small businesses. And then immediately became associated with Greggs for reasons that were not entirely
Greggs
obvious.
PR, I think, because this became then
Greggs PR is very, very good.
Yeah, and then this became like a tax, perceived as a tax on working men and women who had to get their sausage rolls, hot sausage rolls and pasties from Greggs. And then politicians like Cameron and Osborne were questioned about when did you last have a Greggs pasty, and they couldn't quite remember. And Ed Miliband and Ed Bowles did a photo op in a Greggs shop and was munching away on it. I mean, it was a bizarre episode.
Looking very, very out of place, it has to be said. I mean, not Ed Bowles so much, but Ed Miliband, you got the impression he probably didn't use Greggs on a daily basis. You know, it was supposed to be a photo opportunity. He looked dead awkward with it. But yeah,
you do mention Alwyn actually, which is a nice reference back actually, because I'd forgotten this, that in 2010 at Glasgow Airport, you say, when it was being revamped and new shops and takeaways modernized, being put in, they wanted to do away with the Greggs in Glasgow Airport, and the ordinary workers in the airport said, no, that's where we go for lunch. Why are you taking that away?
Yes, it's the one place you can afford, which is part of the point of Greggs. Is, I mean, it became the symbol of it largely because the Sun took it up, and the Sun quite reasonably assumed that many of their readers would be more familiar with Greggs than maybe Ed Miliband was, and it does have a huge constituency. It is vast. I mean, it's a big empire, and it's not purely working class. It is also students, because it offers cheap, quite filling food.
But of course, the interesting thing is looking at it from the perspective of 2021. In the last few years, Greggs itself has had a bit of a rebrand. Now, you can get your vegan pasties, you can get your vegan sausage rolls, you can get your, gluten-free food, all from Greggs as well. So they've kind of changed their own story in a way.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, and it's become a great British institution. I think it probably had. It's just people hadn't recognised it until the hated pasty tax suddenly brought it to the attention of politicians. But I think it is. There are some institutions in Britain where it's not always clear why they've got to this stage. Marks and Spencer's is a story every time it announces its results in a way that Sainsbury's is not.
No.
Tesco is not. Marks and Spencer's somehow represents the beating heart of Middle England. And I think Greggs now represents the beating heart of working class England.
Let's take a question from, this is from Linda Summers. Do you think a system of proportional representation for Westminster elections, while increasing the chances of Farage getting elected to Westminster, would have diluted his power and impact, as he would no longer have been the brave outsider challenging the elite? So would he have been one voice among 650 MPs and not have this bigger platform? So thanks very much, Linda, for that. It's a good question.
It depends on where you start, I guess. In 2015, in the general election, if those results had been the same and we'd had PR, which is in itself arguable because people vote according to the system, but assuming that they were, then UKIP would have had 70 MPs in 2015. Between them, 4
million votes, and that should have translated to huge number. It's a bit like the SDP alliance though in the 80s.
Yeah, between them, in 2015, the Conservative Party and UKIP got 49.5% of the votes. So if it had been a proportional system, they would have had pretty much a ruling government, and it would have been a coalition, an official coalition between Tory and UKIP. That would have given him more power. He would have been in the cabinet, and so would have a couple of his colleagues, I suspect. They would have been bigger than the Lib Dems were in the 2010 coalition.
They would have been on the Lib Dems. You do go back on the history of how Nick Clegg suffered because of the tuition-free decision, which you felt was a little bit unfair in the Lib Dems, because after all, as a minor party in a coalition, you don't get everything that was in your manifesto. And as you say, the tuition fees pledge was actually on page 33 of their manifesto. You didn't expect it to be the defining.
It was not one of their big pledges. It was one that got a lot of photo opportunities, and for those who were affected by it, i.e. students and parents of students, it was an important thing for them. But it was not at the heart of the Lib Dem proposal in this platform at that stage. They had their pledges on the cover of the manifesto,
yes.
and every one of them was implemented.
Yes,
and I don't know, that whole experience was odd. It kind of revealed that we didn't really know how, because we don't do coalitions, we didn't know how they work, because there were endless things of, but you disagree with the Tories. Well, yeah, of course, that's why we're in a different party. You know, I mean, it's not a difficult concept, but somehow we had difficulty with it.
And I was also interested in the focus you gave to, in the run-up to the 2014 European elections, when Nick Clegg, as Deputy Prime Minister, decided to debate on TV with Nigel Farage. And Clegg was a little bit mystified as to, afterwards, in his memoirs, how the hell did I lose that debate? But he was seen as having lost the debate for a number of reasons. You want to explain?
It's an odd bit, because mostly when I write about this stuff, it's not from personal experience. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a Whitehall or a Westminster insider. I know nothing of this. I'm just receiving information the same way that everybody else does, through television and through the radio and newspapers. And I see my role as being that of a consumer, who then records what's happening. But on that one, I happened to be in the audience. It was the only time that I actually have any personal connection.
That's how you knew what the warm-up questions were.
That's why I got the bit from the sound check, where they said, "What have you been doing today?" And Nick Clegg said, "Actually, I happen to have met with Bill Gates." And Nigel Farage says, "Well, I've been promising myself that I shouldn't go to the pub at lunchtime, but I gave in and I went and had a pint." And just in that, you thought, this is the distinction between the two. There's the one who wants to be hobnobbing with the rich and the powerful, and the one who wants to be in the saloon bar telling people why things are wrong. But the bit that Clegg couldn't get on this is at a time when the conflict in Ukraine was very serious, and the EU was siding with those who were anti-Russian in Ukraine, and Clegg was arguing that case, that we needed to not militarily intervene, but we needed to be standing strong against Russia. And Farage's response was basically he didn't think we ought to have anything to do with it at all. We'd had enough of foreign adventuring, and he got a round of applause. And this is a North London audience. This is this was held in Broadcasting House in London. On BBC property, he was getting a round of applause for it, and he couldn't understand that. Clegg couldn't understand. He thought that meant that we were on the side of Putin and Russia.
Yeah.
and that clearly wasn't what we were talking about. It was, again, going back to Iraq. Farage was basically saying, enough of foreign intervention. We ought to be doing some housekeeping at home.
And just by way of the warm-up question answer from Nick Clegg in terms of, I just met Bill Gates. Well, I'm sure now that he's out in Facebook, he's probably bumping into Bill quite frequently.
Indeed,
let's just remind people.
It's worked out well.
A few more questions coming in. I just want to double check. We've got about 10-15 minutes left. Actually, we've talked a little bit about the Chubby Brown versus Jimmy Carr. There's another dimension here which isn't quite as split down the middle, but Nigella Lawson's appeal versus, if you like, Jamie Oliver and the constituencies they were representing. And then, of course, as you point out, the view of Jamie changed a little bit when he started to run in this campaign about, let's feed our kids proper school meals rather than all this processed rubbish they've been given for years. So Nigella first.
Well, Nigella Lawson had tried a media career in the 1990s to no success, or not very little success at any rate. I mean, she did manage to write for The Spectator, but then So did her father edit it, and her brother edit it as
Yes.
well. So it's
There
kind of like
may
family
have been
business.
connections there, yeah.
But she was a talk show host briefly, and was removed from that job because it was felt she wasn't in touch with the public. She was too posh, and in the 1990s, being too posh was a problem. It was a time when Tony Blair, as the first public school boy prime minister in 30 years, was deliberately playing that down. He never talked about his school. He changed his accent, and depending on who he was with, it went very estuary indeed.
Yes.
And he wanted to just be a regular guy. And so being posh was unfashionable. There's a time of Mockneys and Guy Ritchie and Blur and all the rest, culturally. And then the tide turns very, very rapidly. And the early part of this century sees a really massive rise in posh presenters. And Nigella is one of the keys in that, but there's also Jeremy Clarkson, Stephen Fry gets bigger. I know he's been around, and and it suddenly becomes a good thing. And Farage is the beneficiary of that as well, as indeed is Boris Johnson. People who don't apologise for being posh. You wouldn't get very far with the Tony Blair version now. You need to celebrate the fact, and that adds a level of authenticity. People think at least you're being honest. And also, we can look up to you because you maybe, I don't know. I think there is still, despite talk of the death of deference since about 1958.
Yeah.
I think there is still quite a strong element of deference in British.
Okay, so Nigella becomes famous for her cooking skills, but her style and her poshness and everything else, and her beautiful kitchen. Then Jamie Oliver, the Essex lad, starts whizzing around on a moped initially.
Yeah.
And he comes from a different background. Obviously, grew up in a sort of working pub, if you like. And his show represents a different version of modern British culture and food taste. But then he came a little bit unstuck, you feel, on the school food campaign.
He did. I think he was very good on it. I think it was a really interesting use of his celebrity to try to improve what, frankly, is an appalling diet. And he was, I think, being very constructive. But the dominant image that comes out of that program that he made of school dinners is of parents pushing takeaway food through the railings to their poor starved children inside who don't really want broccoli. They wanted some chips. And Jamie Oliver at this stage seems to have become part of the enemy. He has become part of the establishment. And it doesn't matter how cheery and cockney he is, he's one of them who's constantly telling us what to do. And there's a great deal of telling us what to do in modern Britain, and people sometimes go along with it. I think the fact that the smoking ban was so universally and immediately accepted is really quite extraordinary, and we kind of take it for granted, but it's a big deal. And it seemed to be when it was building up to it, and then it just happened and it was okay.
You do have a quote from actually Diane Abbott, I'd say, at one stage, that she said that the Labour Party had gone from listening to our working class voters to telling them what to do. And she cited the smoking ban and also the issue about obesity, which is still an issue for this country, as we've seen with COVID and everything else. But she felt that Labour had gone to sort of talking down to people rather than listening to them.
Yes, and was lecturing us on how we ought to live our private lives. And at some point, I think people said, this is not necessarily the job for politicians. Yes, we do need to improve our diet. Yes, it would be good if we stopped smoking, but stop telling us off all the time.
A few sort of current questions, because you've written many social history books, and I know you've been asked this in recent times as all of the shortages with petrol and supply chains and heating costs. You wrote a book, Crisis What Crisis, about the 70s.
Yes.
So are we heading back to the 70s?
Bits of it will recur. I think there are three really big moments in the 70s, and they're all very brief. There's the miners' strike at the beginning of 1972 when the lights went out for the first time. There's the 3-day week at the beginning of 1974 when things were really tight. and there's the winter of discontent at the beginning of 1979. And what they have in common, the reason that they remain part of the mythology of the country, or the accepted kind of folklore of it almost, they are very concentrated. It's not a series of things going wrong one after another. It's everything happens at the same time. And when you get that, it sticks. And I don't think we've got to that stage. We had the fuel shortages, the panic buying, which was a very 70s thing. But then there wasn't other stuff going wrong at the same point. And that seems to me that's where you
need a few months, you're basically saying, of it all going pear-shaped, and then suddenly people say this isn't working anymore.
Yeah, then it feels if the government has lost control. But if it's a problem that can be addressed, and then another problem is going to come along in 2 weeks' time, that can also be addressed, then that governments can cope with that. It's when everything hits.
As I say, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, and there's a question from Jennifer Gilling, which I'm going to read to you, which says, do you think that the corruption and mismanagement of the Tory government, as well as the damaging effects of Brexit now apparent in everyday life, will contribute to the Scots viewing Scottish independence more positively? Bear in mind, we're on the border here in Berwick-upon-Tweed. Jennifer Gilling, and Jennifer, just to say that in the book, you do deal with the Scottish referendum in 2014, how important it was, and how motivated people were to have their views heard.
It was an extraordinary turnout, apart from anything else, which should have been a clue towards the Brexit vote as well. If you ask people and you say, we will act on what you do, they will turn out in greater numbers. I assume that anything that besmirches the Tories further is probably in the SNP's interest and in the interests of people who wish independence. I've got to say, it's not my area of knowledge, and this book, unlike previous ones, the subtitle is England in the early 21st century. The previous ones have been Britain in the 1970s, 1980s, and so on. It feels to me that by this century, with the devolution settlement of the late 1990s, we've got to a stage where the constituent nations of the United Kingdom are definitely going their separate ways, and they have.
So you made that point in terms of the share of the vote, didn't you, in 2015? Well, the Conservatives by themselves, actually, they won England.
Oh, yeah, indeed, yes, yeah.
And,
but they did in 2005 as well, when it was the third Blair landslide. Actually, the Tories got the biggest vote in England, and that's the countries, their histories are diverging, and I assume at some point then the formal structures will also diverge. But I would need to know considerably more about Scotland than I do.
Otherwise, we could all sign up to that. We need to know more intimately, but we are, as you say, at another possible moment of seismic change. So, as a social historian, how well rewarded do you think historians will be looking at the Johnson premiership? There seems to be a lot of material there.
Yes, and may go on, for some time yet. And I don't know. It's way too early to tell. It is perfectly possible that in 50 years' time, looking at it, that the AUKUS deal with America and Australia on defence may be more important than Brexit.
Really?
That kind of realignment
in terms of taking away from NATO, shifting that.
Yeah, the potential for the decline of NATO and therefore the rise of a European defence force. These things may be bigger. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to judge at this stage, because when you're in the midst of it, it's often the trivial stuff that matters. It seems, and to some extent, that's what I try to do with my books, is to remind people of the trivial stuff that they forgot, because it is damn trivial, but nonetheless is sometimes entertaining. But yeah, Lord knows what we make of Johnson. Except that the one thing I would say is that whole business about was Tony Blair lying about Iraq, I think, is still informing politics, because we now assume that if Tony Blair, of all people, did not tell the truth, as I say, regardless of whether that's the case or not, but we assume that, then we shouldn't be surprised we have a prime minister who doesn't tell the truth, and people know that, and they don't count it against it, because it is now assumed that all politicians are like that. Blair was supposed to be the break and the change, but if he's not, if he turns out to be the same as the others, then we might as well vote for somebody who's almost nakedly a liar.
Allegedly, as they say. But what a beautiful and professional way we started with Blair and the damage done to his reputation, and you brought it all back around to that question. But I want to ask you just one last question, because you're a very prolific author, and you've done lots of books on history. You're also an expert on military bands. So what's the current project?
I'm looking at the Edwardians at the moment.
Well, that's going back. That's a bit far back for you.
It is, but I'm hoping that I might be able to approach it in the same way, that by taking not just the politics, but the popular culture of the time, the music hall, which I'm very fond of, and the popular fiction and stuff, it might be possible to look at the country at that stage. Because mostly I've been doing it in a period of mass media, so it's kind of easy. What's the popular culture? Well, it's the stuff on telly, it's sitcoms and soaps, isn't it? But trying to do that in a period before the mass media, I think might be interesting.
Well, you have the right waistcoat for a man researching music hall, and it would be something to look forward to. Just remind people again, all in it together. As you've seen from the diverse nature of our conversation, there's fantastic stuff in here. I would certainly recommend it. And also, as they always say, it's available in all good bookshops, but a reminder that independent bookshops, including Greaves here in Berwick-upon-Tweed, will have it, and it's very important to support those. Lots more to come later on tonight and on Monday, on Saturday and Sunday here at the Berwick Literary Festival. And just before I say again, thank you to Alwyn for joining us. A reminder that if you like the event, perhaps promote us on social media. Even more crucially, as you know, these events are free. If you feel like making a donation, you can do it at berwickliteraryfestival.com or on our Facebook page. But for now, thank you to Alwyn Turner for joining me this afternoon, and see you again at another episode here at the Berwick Literary Festival. But for now, goodbye.